saw it written and I saw it say, Pink moon is on its way. None of you stand so tall. Pink moon gonna get you all. It's a pink moon. There's a pink moon. Pink, 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 pink. Pink moon.
The song we're listening to is called Pink Moon. It was written by the English musician Nick Drake and released on his third and final album, also titled Pink Moon, in February of 1972. Tragically, Drake died 2 years later at only 26 years old, and his final album sold less than 5,000 copies. Fast forward 27 years to 1999. According to legend, Volkswagen ad execs hear Pink Moon being played by an employee and decide it's the song for their first ever ad on the internet. And practically overnight, Pink Moon goes to number 5 on the Amazon sales charts and sparks a resurgence of interest in Nick Drake's music.
Pink moon is on its way. None of you stand so tall. Pink moon gonna get you home. It's a pink moon. Yes, pink moon.
Our next guest is the songwriter and music journalist Jeff Slate. Jeff, welcome to The Future of What?
Thanks for having me, Portia.
So you wrote an article for Esquire in which you discuss Nick Drake's Pink Moon and about its startling resurgence thanks to an advertisement. Can you give us the rundown on that?
Well, it's really interesting. You know, Nick's catalog had fallen. I mean, he never really caught on in his lifetime. Probably around the time he started to make records that people were maybe paying attention to a little bit, he committed suicide. You know, he had suffered problems with depression his whole life. It's a family issue as well. And so his catalog just kind of fell dormant. He never really sold records in his lifetime. And, you know, over the years, Island Records did some reissues of his albums, but never really did any big push behind them. And then sometime in the maybe 80s, some enterprising people at Island got the idea to put a little push behind them. And they kind of gently pushed Nick's catalog out there into the world at a time when there were just so many other artists. And he started to catch on with sort of tastemakers. And I think, you know, he caught the ear of Robin Hitchcock and Paul Weller and people like that who, you know, it's funny, that would end up paying dividends for them in the 90s when, you know, they would see resurgences in their own careers and be able to talk about him in the press. But this guy, Caddy Calloway, started working Nick's catalog very kind of carefully with the family. And he took it on as kind of a personal mandate. I mean, a labor of love. And it was kind of remarkable. He had gone from doing A&R and working at labels to managing acts, and he decided he wanted to manage an act who was dead. He felt like a lot of people were doing that and kind of doing it wrongly or poorly, and he saw Nick as kind of the perfect person to do that with because the family was still there. They had opinions about how his catalog could be presented, and he had a real empathy for the music. He'd kind of grown up with it, been introduced to it via sampler records that Island used to put out in the 70s, and kind of discovered his whole catalog over the course of the years. And so he put things out there into the world and, you know, did a compilation with Ryko Disc after much Island wanted nothing to do with it. They'd earned their money back on the 3,000-pound advances they'd given Nick, and they were kind of like, okay, well, we're fine with this. And Chris Blackwell was kind of, you know, laissez-faire about it. He just didn't really care very much. So Caddy took this on himself to do a compilation called Way to Blue with Ryko Disc. And it really caught on, I think, you know, sort of every college student that was maybe 89, 90, 91, had that in their dorm room, he joked with me. And it caught on in a very grassroots manner. And, he was very careful when, offers came in from movies or television commercials. He told me about McDonald's wanting to use his song and things, which would have been great. But the family didn't need the money, and he didn't think that was right for Nick's trajectory. And so, at some point in the 90s, the people who had bought that Way to Blue compilation became advertising executives who were aspiring to, feather their nests at these, they were young and ambitious. And a guy came to him and said, here's the idea, and sort of had a storyboard for it and so forth. And, he presented it to the family, Nick's sister mainly, and they liked it. And they were very careful to sort of see rough cuts and be involved in the process. And there were some directors as well who came to them and did that. But that use in the Volkswagen commercial came about from, oddly enough, them saying more no than it did them saying yes. In other words, they would get a lot of offers because Nick's catalog was relatively easy to acquire a license for by advertising people or film people. And they said no to almost everything, except when they felt it really served the story or it didn't sort of bastardize the song. And so this came up and they really liked the storyboard. They liked the idea. They liked the ad agency. They thought they were sort of empathetic to Nick as an artist, and put it out into the world. And it then became this other thing. It probably sold far more Nick Drake records and put him on the map than it did Volkswagen Jettas. I think that was the car they were, advertising at the time.
Cabriolet,
and I think. Everybody of a certain age remembers that commercial. And it's one of those things. There's not a lot of commercials from, the late 90s that are on YouTube, but that's one of them. And it has, thousands of views because it really is a remarkable sort of a music video without being a music video. So that's maybe too long, but the short version of the history of the commercial, at least.
And that was a particularly special commercial because it was the first time they were putting an ad on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was sort of a new format for something like that. So it did sort of have that potential to be a little music video.
Yep. It was a strange, confluence of things. I think a lot of artists who were toying with the internet, I mean, myself as a songwriter, I put out an album in 98 and offered it, sales online, just physical CDs, not sort of MP3s, and some streaming early. I think it was like real audio samples. But, we sold a lot of CDs via the internet when we expected to sell none. And I just chalked it up to, it was the Christmas season, it's new and whatever, the internet being relatively new in the late 90s. And it wasn't that. I think the artists who toyed with new media early on, even though it was the Wild West, saw things, really kind of mushroom in a way they didn't expect. David Bowie talked about that, and Trent Reznor has talked about that. So I think this was just sort of part and parcel of that. It did feel new and fresh. It didn't feel like an old person's commercial. It didn't feel like a traditional way of presenting either a song or the product they were trying to sell. And it kind of dovetailed with the early rumblings, the sort of Wild West nature of the internet at that time.
And it really sparked something different because from that moment on, I think people saw the potential for licensing as not just necessarily co-opting a song, an artist's song, but rather as sort of adding art to art.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there were a swath of directors at that time, and certainly Quentin Tarantino is probably the foremost, who utilized music that you were maybe familiar with, but more likely didn't know the artist or didn't know the song, but used it very effectively, not to kind of help tell the story, but as sort of an emotional cue. And I think, Martin Scorsese had done that, but a little more obviously than Quentin Tarantino did. And then there became a lot of copycat directors who did that, some very effectively, some not so, but it did become a new way of utilizing the original versions of songs that your parents might have had the 45 when you were a kid and you remember it and you have an emotional connection to it, but it was using it to sort of give you emotional cues rather than the old style, literal, the lyrics kind of tell the story of what you're seeing on the screen. And I think that was very true of the Pink Moon commercial and very true of a lot of uses in advertising and film in the late 90s, 2000s.
And what do you think about the story that you tell is very thoughtful curation of a catalog by a specific person who knew a lot about the music industry. Do you think that that's necessary for this kind of success to happen to an artist?
Well, it always comes down to the song, ultimately. I think you can, the old saying, you can kind of put lipstick on a pig. You can break a song that's maybe mediocre but catchy by just repeated listenings, repeated viewings, that kind of thing. But I think there are any number of ways to utilize music in a song, and artists can be totally mercenary about it. I've worked with Pete Townsend in the past, and we've talked about his use of catalog. And his thing was, when he started to sell the Who catalog, mainly 3 or 4 songs that everybody kept asking for, and everybody knows, Who Are You and Won't Get Fooled Again, Baba O'Reilly, or on CSI and all these other shows, just about any action show or police procedural nowadays. And, from his point of view, radio had kind of died. And for a new audience, to remind his old audience that the Who were still out there and he was still out there as a songwriter, and that those songs still existed, but also to attract new listeners and younger people to the songs, he wanted them out there, and he was very aggressive about that. And my teenage son is very aware of those songs, and all his friends are. And they're less aware of, say, the Rolling Stones, who are not as aggressive because of that. They're on TV all the time, and those songs, and they're used in car commercials, and you can begrudge that. And certainly as an artist, you can choose not to do that, and you can choose the more sort of empathetic, more thoughtful way to approach things, and that may have a longer tail for your success. But the impact is pretty profound. I licensed some of my songs, and the uptick, I was fortunate they were in big shows, One Tree Hill and Gossip Girl, or the sort of big ones. And, I still, many years later, get royalty checks, and residuals for those performances, for those uses. And my other songs that I did not license, I just get sort of the modest royalty payments from, not even CD sales, but MP3 sales or streaming. So, I think there are many reasons to do it from an artist standpoint, not the least of which is more people become aware of you and want to know more about you if the music touches them. But I think the key is the performance and the song have to be special.
Jeff Slate is a songwriter and music journalist. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us on The Future of What?
Thanks, Portia. It was a pleasure.
You're listening to The Future of What? We're talking about the value of catalog. We'll be right back. I'm Portia Sabin, and today on The Future of What, we're talking about the value of catalog. Catalog is the name for songs that are owned by record labels or musicians that aren't new, but rather reside on artists' older albums. Catalog is driving a lot of conversation in the music industry right now, and our next guest has jumped into the fray with a study showing that 95% of catalog is irrelevant to most listeners. Mark Mulligan is an analyst at Media Research, and he joins us by phone from London. Mark, welcome to The Future of What?
Hi, thanks for having me.
So can you describe for our listeners your anatomy of a digital catalog chart?
Sure. So throughout the history of digital music, so going right back to the days of iTunes, let alone what's happening these days with the streaming era, there's been a catalogue arms race. Music services have been boldly stating just how many tracks they have as almost as sort of a stamp of quality, and that's really accelerated in scale over the last 4 or 5 years because we've had so many more people releasing music with lots of services and that enable a bedroom artist to be able to get their music straight onto Spotify and iTunes, etc. And we've seen a proliferation of new music getting out there, lots of small labels putting out music as well, and then a huge amount of filler dribble from things like karaoke versions, deliberate sound alikes that are only ever intended to try to trick people into listening or buying, appearing to be the original track. And there's a lot of money to be made from that, from all the people who put that money up, and the music services love having the big numbers. So just over the last few years, the average catalogue size has grown from the high 20s of millions to the mid 30s of millions, and are growing at between 100 and 150,000 new tracks every single month. And when you actually break that down, it means that if you've got this huge catalogue of say 25, 30 million songs, the actual amount that people listen to is really actually quite small. The majority of it, about 80% of it, is hardly frequented at all. There have been studies to show that there are millions upon millions of songs in music catalogues that have never even been listened to once. Not much, but not even listened to once. So you then get to the core catalogue, and the core catalogue is the music that's listened to some degree of frequency, in most places in the world, and that's round about 20% of the catalogue. And depending on how big the total catalogue is, that's between 5 and 6 million. And that's really where, if we go back to when iTunes was big, that's the numbers they used to talk about. But the actual share that people listen to a lot, then we get to a tiny little share, and it's really only about 250,000 tracks that are listened to frequently by a significant number of people.
And in a recent blog post, you said you called what we've got in the streaming place right now, the streaming market, the $9.99 all-you-can-eat model. And what is it that you find problematic with that model?
So the all-you-can-eat model is absolutely fantastic if you're a music aficionado, somebody who really loves music. Because if you love music, then you've got the appetite, the interest, and the expertise to go and find the music you love. And you know where to look to find other music that you think you're probably going to like. You're going to know which playlists to follow and which sites to look at, etc. And you get lots and lots of value. If you're a more mainstream music fan who maybe only buys the occasional album here and then, or the occasional single, or just streams music on YouTube, then you actually rely upon people pointing you to where to go. And actually, all the music in the world can suddenly seem like an absolutely bewildering proposition. In fact, you have a paralysis of choice, a tyranny of choice, where there's so much choice that for the mainstream music fan, it's effectively no choice at all. And so what they end up doing is just going for the familiar. They'll go for the charts. They'll go for the what's recommended by the music service that happens to be on the front page, which is typically where most people go, and that's dominated by the superstars, which means you get a self-fulfilling prophecy where that small amount of core capital gets even more frequented because the mainstream music consumers don't have the time, inclination, expertise to actually go and dive into the deeper capital.
And you have a suggestion for a solution to this problem, which is niche playlisting?
Yes, I think there's probably a couple of ways in which the challenge of the tyranny of choice can be addressed. One is actually an enforcement side of things. So as perhaps a controversial suggestion, but first of all, I think that karaoke tracks should be put in a different catalogue. Not getting them when. So there's a lot of people love karaoke. Not going to take anything away from the value of those karaoke tracks, but they should be put under another section of a music service so that they don't clutter up results. Because often it's difficult to tell which, whether it's a karaoke track you're listening to, or you're about to stream, or the actual original track. Next, and this is for me shouldn't have a second of hesitation, is getting rid of all of the filler dribble. So what I mean by that is all of the sound alikes, the tracks which are cynically produced to sound exactly like the original in order just to generate cynical revenue, they should be stripped out immediately. Then you're left with a smaller amount of catalogue to deal with. Still bewildering for many, so that's where I think the niche playlists come in. If we think about it, even though most of us will say we like lots of kinds of music, there's probably a few kinds of music we like best. And so building curated playlist services just around individual genres, individual styles of music, and selling them at smaller prices that reflect that they're just one genre, that could be a way to not only unlock the music catalogues, it could be a way to unlock the potential of music subscriptions, which right at the moment are still a niche proposition.
Who do you see doing the curation of these niche playlists?
Well, there are many candidates. Let's just take a single genre as an illustration. If we were to have an EDM an EDM service, and let's say it was packaged up, and you got a dozen playlists a week, and you paid $3.99 for it, and some of those playlists are compilations, that well-known dance compilations, and some of them will be curated by the in-house editors, but other ones very obviously will be curated by big brands in EDM. So some of those could be DJs, some could be producers, some could be festivals, some could be clubs, be the key music journalists, some could be sort of potential curators. When you dive into a genre which has a passionate following, whether that's Latin, Christian, jazz, blues, classical, EDM, it doesn't matter. Once you get into a genre and the fans of a genre, there are lots of very obvious figureheads. People are trusted and recognized arbiters of taste within that genre.
I think that's a fine idea. I just wonder how we would entice those people to create the playlists if there wasn't a real financial incentive for them to do it.
So I think incenting curators is obviously a big issue, and it's an issue which is at the moment being grappled with in the all you can eat services. Over here in the UK, we've got Ministry of Sound, a very well established independent dance music focused label, and they actually had a court case with Spotify over whether Ministry of Sound should effectively be getting paid some sort of fee for curating. That was settled out of court, which means that decision is still, essentially one remaining to be challenged. But with this great irony that curation is what all of these music services are saying that is, what they position around this. We've got the best curation, the best programming, the best editorial, and yet curation doesn't have any monetary value in the streaming economy from a consumer's perspective. The playlist is the currency of streaming. Yet whoever pays for a playlist. So I think so you're absolutely right. Huge challenge about how you do it, but ultimately I think this is something that all music services are going to have to learn how to do. That is how to ensure that they pay for some of the most valuable component of what they're about, and that is curation.
Mark Mulligan is an analyst at Media Research, and he has joined us by phone from London. Mark, thank you so much for your time.
That's my pleasure.
Stay tuned for more catalog talk on the future of what. Matt Daniels is the editor of Polygraph. He joins us on the future of what right now. Thanks, Matt, for joining us.
Thank you.
So you guys have this great chart at poly-graph.co that people can check out, and it is sort of a play count study. It shows you guys looked at the play counts on Spotify between 1990 and 99. Is that correct?
Yeah, roughly.
So your chart shows which songs are the most popular songs on Spotify, which have gotten the most plays between those years. I mean, the songs, not during those years, but actually the songs from those years.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us what you found?
Yeah, so the idea was to look at present-day popularity of music throughout time. And I had Billboard data going back to roughly 1950 through today. So the idea was to compare popularity of music in its day and then having the second data point of Spotify data, giving you an idea of how popular this music is today, and then attempting to normalize the data as much as possible by just looking at Spotify plays for 2014.
Cool. So this chart that we can look at is just the years 1990 to 1999, but you actually have data for since 1950?
Yeah, so the article has data going back to 1950 through 2005, which is roughly like 10 years, any song older than 10 years old.
Wow, that is really cool. Now, you only looked at songs that charted on the Billboard Hot 100, right? From the 1990 to 1999 population?
Yeah, so the idea was that since I had Billboard data that gave us an idea of how popular music was in its day, that would exclude any song that never charted. So I believe Stairway to Heaven, as an example, never charted in its day.
Uh-huh.
So that would be excluded from the list.
Gotcha. That would be an interesting thing for you guys to publish, is the stuff that never charted in its day, but that's really popular nowadays.
Yeah, it's a weird data set because it's basically all music ever.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely.
So the surprises on your chart are like songs like the song that we played right before we introduced you, which is Save Tonight by Eagle Eye Cherry from the year 1999, which has over 21 million plays on Spotify. What do you think accounts for the popularity of a song like that, which is really, I mean, super one-hit wonder?
Like why is it popular on Spotify today?
Yeah, like what do you think causes that popularity?
Well, on one hand, I'm not sure how old you are, but you have certain connotations of that song being a one-hit wonder and maybe like very sad-like connotations. But Spotify's user base actually skews pretty young. So that song came out in 1999. Anyone younger than like 20 has no cultural bias towards that song. So what makes that song interesting is probably that it's to like an 18-year-old kid in high school. It's no different than any other song that they're finding from the late 90s. So that's what I would say, like, what's interesting to me about the success of a song like that.
That's so interesting. I mean, how do you feel about that? Because basically what that suggests is that for a huge population of Spotify users, music is kind of context free.
Yeah, and it's always been this way. So if you were to listen to your parents' generation music, really anything that you weren't alive or maybe younger than 10 years old when it was released, it is context free. And when they look at you listening to their music, they might be shocked at what you gravitate towards. Yeah, so Spotify it's actually no different. We just have a lot of data around what exactly those listening habits are.
Do you have any kind of correlation, or would you be interested in doing some kind of correlation with songs that have gotten advertising spots or syncs, sort of high profile syncs? Because I wonder about that with some of the songs on your chart.
Yeah, so plenty of things affect any music's popularity. I mean, this is something that the record industry has known for a while, that if it's in advertising or if it's in a movie or if it's in a soundtrack or if it's covered or if it's on Glee, I mean, there's a number of things that affect a song's popularity. So the thing to be careful about is whether it's correlated or causally related. If a song's popularity is because of the fact that it was in a certain form of media, or maybe it's just popular and therefore it's in that media. So there's definitely a lot of complexity around what you're speaking about. And I haven't really dived deeply into something like that just because of the enormous complexity in even identifying the songs that are featured in certain types of media.
Absolutely. And I'm I did a little bit of research on the Proclaimers song that's on your chart. I'm Gonna Be 500 Miles. That's got over 14 million plays on Spotify. And so I went and did a little looking around about that song because, that song was famously in several sync placements that sort of upped its profile. And according to Wikipedia, that one song makes 5 times what the Proclaimers' entire catalog combined makes for them in terms of money. So it can really make a big difference in an artist's career to have that one song get either a good sync placement or some kind of, to be brought to the surface in some way.
Of course. I mean, catalogs are worth probably arguably even more now that streaming is far more pervasive. So when you think about the Proclaimers and their revenue streams today, before they were probably banking more on repeated use in movies and soundtracks and commercials, Whereas now, actually, like streaming is probably a really viable channel for them to stay relevant. But no, I don't think that surprises me at all. And in fact, I'd probably imagine that most artists probably have a few songs that more or less play into a Pareto principle of 20% of their music generates 80% of their revenue, and then maybe in this instance it's even higher.
Definitely. We spoke earlier in this show with Mark Mulligan, who's an analyst at Media Research in London, and he had a chart that showed that only 1% of catalog really creates the bulk of revenue for artists. The 1% of the total catalog that's out there on Spotify, and only 5% is what he would call frequently listened to. So it sort of makes 95% of all catalog irrelevant. But I think what you're kind of saying, and what I think I would say, is that there's a lot of potential in that 95%, because you never know what's going to end up, on a compilation or in an ad or somewhere that suddenly brings it into popularity, and then boom, streaming just goes crazy.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to our earlier point that there are plenty of songs throughout history that were never popular in their day and have slowly grown in popularity over time, which definitely makes catalog music more interesting as like an asset if you're an artist or a record label. And the other interesting thing is, to your point earlier, like 1% of the catalog drives like 90% of the revenue. Something like half of Spotify songs have never been listened to. They have 0 plays, which isn't surprising, again, because it's kind of a buffet of all music from any artist, and anyone can upload anything. So yeah, I think all those points are definitely prescient and interesting, and I could definitely get behind them.
Do you think that's a problem, the fact that so many songs are not listened to? I mean, do you see that as something that we should be trying to remedy, or do you just sort of see that academically as, that's of academic interest?
I mean, I think we would have to go in to figure out, like, well, what are we actually looking at? So is it half of all songs that have never been played that are released by like a major record label and they have significant investment behind? Or is it just actually the entire internet? So anyone that can upload a song to Spotify. And in which case, like, yeah, I'd expect that probably to be about right. In fact, most artists, if they have or this probably is the case with writing on blogs or even self-published books, like I would doubt a lot of them sell over 1,000 copies. So those dynamics probably exist in music as well. But I think I'd definitely be interested in looking at where there are barriers to entry of all of the tracks from Motown, for example. They probably place their bets way less frequently, and I would bet that the listening habits show a curve where there are definitely very, very popular songs, but I don't think there would be very many unpopular songs, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, especially when you think about genre. If when you factor in genre, because there's certainly, I would assume, people who, for example, Motown, that's a good example, they love that sound. They're going to listen to a lot of that type of music, not just the most popular.
Yeah, and especially in genre, you have people who listen to music as albums. So if you look at those songs that have never been played before, probably because they're deep in an album, and unless you're listening to an album in its completeness, like you never get to that song. So if it's a genre where it lends itself to listening to a full album, I think you probably have a lot more of a distribution of listening across all of an artist's tracks or all of the genre's tracks.
I think you're right. I would agree with that. And that would be an interesting study to do. So I have now given you about 7 assignments, and I went to see some of these studies.
Yeah.
That'd be awesome. Matt Daniels is the editor of Polygraph. Matt, thank you so much for joining us on The Future of What?
All right. No problem. Thank you.
You're listening to The Future of What? And we're talking about the value of catalog. Right now, we're going to talk to Jim Selby, who's the president of AdShare. Jim, thanks for joining us on The Future of What?
Happy to be here.
So you spent the large part of your professional life in publishing, correct?
No, I spent the large portion of my career on the label side, and for a little shy of 2 years, I was with a major independent music publisher in Nashville.
Oh, I'm glad I asked you that in public, that I did not know that about you. That's
good.
Brings that right out. That's cool. Okay, so you've been working in publishing recently.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought you would be a good person to ask about catalog because, of course, publishers are quite concerned with catalog.
Mm-hmm.
So can you explain really how sort of catalog management works in the world of publishing?
Sure. There's different kinds of catalogs, I guess. At a music publisher, there would be your active catalogs, which have been released on and commercially available. And then you have catalogs that would unreleased compositions that would be waiting to be pitched to record labels for cuts on albums and singles and all that kind of stuff. And then you have kind of a non-traditional catalog of, say, film and TV music that would be composed music for television shows and major motion pictures and all that kind of stuff. So those are kind of how we would view catalog. And they all kind of operate a little differently. The catalog of commercially released or active titles, you're hoping for performance income, which is the majority of the income, mechanical income, and sync licensing income kind of make up the profile of revenue from that, kind of bucket of catalog. And then the kind of uncut song catalog, we're trying to get those released by record labels. Some of them may go direct to sync. Some of them may go, to record labels to be cut into albums. And then we have and then, of course, there's not much revenue generated on that catalog unless, of course, an uncut song is pitched to an advertising agency or film and TV for synchronization in one of those kind of media. And then, of course, we have the film and TV catalog, which the majority of the income comes from the cable broadcast side. So there would be no radio performance and virtually little sync and no mechanical income. So that's kind of the income streams and how I see, kind of three buckets of catalog for music publishers.
So I think what's going on, or at least what I understand right now, is that there's this interest, this sort of rise in interest in the investment community for record label back catalog, which would be one of the categories of songs that you've talked about, which is released music that has been released on various albums over time, but not necessarily has met with commercial success. Some of it is simply, or like, let's say even an album that has one hit track on it, it's got, 10 other tracks on it that aren't hits.
Mm-hmm.
So that would make up this music catalog that I'm talking about that the investor community is suddenly interested in. What do you think their interest is about in that catalog? I mean, what is it makes that type of catalog attractive at this moment?
I think some of this comes from a lot of these investors have been investing in music publishing assets for quite a while, and they're starting to see the recorded masters acting more like music publishing with the rise of Sound Exchange, which operates very similar as a music publishing PRO does. It's very predictable income. And if you look at the revenue side of this, it took ASCAP and BMI 10 years to get, collectively over $1 billion in domestic payouts. It took Sound Exchange under 10 years to do that. So the investment community sees this as a tremendous opportunity to invest in assets that they may have undervalued a few years ago. And now they see the performance income, which is very familiar income to them, rising dramatically. They're far more interested in the master side than the music publishing, well, equally in the music publishing. I think the music publishing has probably gotten expensive for a lot of investors. So they're looking for value, looking for opportunity. And I think that's where the interest has come for the master side now.
Did you mean that the PROs took 100 years to get to $1 billion?
They took 100 years to get to. If you look at ASCAP and BMI, they both paid out about $600 million last year domestically each, and it took them 100 years, almost 100 years to get to that point.
Wow. Whereas Sound Exchange got there in 10 years.
Got there in 10 years, yes.
That's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that strikes me as a label owner as something that might be appealing to the investors is the fact that catalog, master side catalog, doesn't carry any financial outlay with it. You don't have to grow an artist. You know, it's not like investing in a new album.
Right. And you know, when there's kind of two mindsets on when you look at music publishing investing, you have the companies that they basically buy music catalogs and sit on them and try to collect the money more efficiently. And then you have other companies that buy catalog, but then add the creative services around those, or the value add services, which would be sync and creative and signing new songwriters and all that kind of stuff to extract further value out of the catalogs and the writers that they have. So, you know, one is, there's just two different strategies. One is just really a buy and hold and collect, and the other one is to invest further in the creative kind of value add process of music publishing.
Jim Selby is the president of AdShare, and I was extremely happy that you joined us. Thanks so much for being on The Future of What.
Oh, it was a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Portia.
And that's our show. The music we played today was used by permission. You heard Nick Drake, Eagle Eye Cherry, The Proclaimers, and of course our theme song, Mind Your Own Business by the Delta 5. If you have a question you want answered on the show, please email us at thefutureofwhat@gmail.com. Our episodes are archived at killrockstars.com/thefutureofwhat, and you can subscribe to our podcast on Bandcamp. Our program is produced by John Sepulvedo and Will Watts. I'm Portia Sabin, president of Kill Rockstars. See you next week.
Mind your own